Hello and welcome. My name is Eric Thompson, Communications Coordinator with the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen, the RDOS. Welcome to the second electronic town hall for Colleen Parkland Acquisition Loan Authorization Bylaw, Sickle Point Bylaw number 2915, 2020. Just a quick note, answers to some of the questions received via WebEx Messenger during the first electronic town hall on January 13th have been posted, in fact, on RDOS Regional Connections. That's www.rdosregionalconnections.ca. We have three presenters for this town hall: Bill Newell, RDOS Chief Administrative Officer; Christy Malden, RDOS Manager of Legislative Services; and the Manager of Finance for the RDOS, Jim Zaffino. We'd like to welcome our RDOS directors who are watching as well. In just a moment, we'll have details on how you can participate in this electronic town hall. We'll have opening comments from our presenters, and then we'll get to questions and answers. First, quick presentation on how the RDOS is informing the community about this particular alternative approval process. The RDOS created an interactive map for Colleen Parks and Recreation Service Area Bylaw number 1554, and this provides information about whether your property is located within the service area. Newspaper ads have been published, as well as a site on the page on the RDOS website. I mentioned Regional Connections. We have that as well with a dedicated page. Excuse me. Also, RDOS Facebook and Twitter social media channels have provided information. The Civic Ready mass notification system has been used to provide information, as well as a mail out and notices posted in the community. And then, of course, we have this public meeting. Now, during this electronic town hall, anyone wishing to ask questions via WebEx or telephone will be given an opportunity to do so based on the time available. If you are participating by computer using WebEx, please click the raise hand button. You can find that in the participants panel on the right side of your computer screen, and this will indicate that you would like to speak. And then if you are participating using that process as well, we invite you to hit *3 to lower your hand as well when you're done. Now, if you are participating by phone, please press 3 on your phone's keypad. This will indicate that you would like to speak. *3. And having indicated that you wish to speak, you'll then be placed in the queue and then invited to speak. Now, we'll get started with some opening comments with, first of all, Bill Newell, CAO with the Regional District. Mr. Newell? And I'll just remind Mr. There we go.
Sorry, somebody just ran in and told me I was on mute. I want to discuss the roles of the various players in this process. And the three major ones are the Regional District, our Colleen Recreation Commission, and of course the electors in that Parks and Recreation Service. So just starting out, I would say that it's the role of the Regional District to provide services that the board considers necessary or desirable for all or part of a community. And that's our charge under the Local Government Act. We also have responsibility for stewardship of assets, but mostly in this case, we're looking at providing service. So the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service was established back in 1988. It's one of our more mature services. And in the establishment bylaw process, which is again done by public assent, we identify the geographic area that the service will cover. And then only those electors within that geographic area vote whether they want to create that service or not. And back in 1988, that vote was affirmative based on the geographic area that we have now, and it's attached to the establishment bylaw. Okay. So in that, we established a recreation commission that would be our advocates in the community. So we rely on them to provide development of a program that will come under this service. They're certainly involved in the development of the annual budget that would come under the service. And I want to say, because I know this can be a contentious process, is that the Recreation Commission are volunteers. They chose this way to give back to their community. They are recreation and public space advocates for sure, but they do a good job keeping us connected to the local community and as to what the priorities and the preferences are of the people within that electoral area. And if it's not representative of the whole area, then those that feel disenfranchised should be volunteering to sit on that commission. There is a responsibility to be proactive for the taxes that you pay. So having said that, let me go on and say that Sickle Point has been of interest, and we know that through calls and contacts that we get about the development potential on Sickle Point. We know it's been of interest for a number of years, and it is currently privately held. And when it came on the market for sale, the Parks and Recreation Commission recommended that we test the waters to see if the electors within that Parks and Recreation Service would be willing to buy it. So that's the process that we are entered into now, is to determine if the electors in that area want to borrow that money to pay for the park. The board of directors agreed with that recommendation from the commission, and we started on the process. And our role is to administer the regulatory process that is developed around borrowing for a regional district, and that requires public assent. When we were determining which process to use for the elector assent, it was determined that the alternative approval process would be appropriate in this service, because we're under a court-ordered sale, and there's times that are required that we meet, or the property may be sold and we would lose our chance. So the alternative approval process is usually quicker, it's usually cheaper, and it also has a much lower threshold for defeating the bylaw. So 10% on the alternative approval process if they vote against, whereas a full referendum would be the majority, or 50% of those electors voting. So there's some differences in the two for sure. The regional district is not the advocate for the process. We're the regulator. And we ensure that fact-based information is provided for those that are going to be impacted by the borrowing bylaw. And our job then is to widely communicate that out to the electors. The community's role is to determine whether they want to borrow the money to buy that property or not. And they have to debate that amongst themselves, which I understand is rigorous right now. And there's going to be those that are in favor of borrowing the money, and there are going to be those that are opposed. And over the course of the 30 days that were open for receiving objections under this process, each side is going to try and convince the other which way they want to go. So that's your role, though. Ours is to administer the process. It's up to the electors to determine if they're going to borrow that money to buy the property. Okay, so having said that, Sickle Point is a 4-acre parcel located on Skaha Lake in Area I in Colleen. And it is currently zoned residential single family. And it is currently the subject of an application for subdivision. In the midst of that, the property went into foreclosure. The mortgagee went to court and got an order that allows them to sell the property in order to obtain their mortgage money that they put into the property. So there are timelines around that. And there are certainly conditions that the mortgagee has to meet in order to get permission from the court to sell the property. And we have now agreed with the realtor for the petitioner to the court, which is the mortgagee, that they will allow us to complete the alternative approval process, and if it's successful, then we would be able to go ahead and they would submit our offer to the court with their recommendation. If it fails, then we go back to the board and advise them that it has failed, and they will then go through the process to rescind the bylaws. At that point, they can then determine whether they want to go to a full referendum or whether they will not further pursue the property. So that would be a decision after February 8th, once the objection period has passed. So let us talk about the establishment bylaw and the requisition limit. So I've already established that the service establishment bylaw includes the geographic area, and that is done by, in 1988, it was done by referendum on this service. The other inclusion in an establishment bylaw is a requisition limit, and usually it's either an amount or based on the assessment, and then the amount for the requisition limit would float up with the increase in the assessment each year. And that is indeed, there is indeed a requisition limit in bylaw, the Cleveland Parks and Recreation bylaw. So the question is the requisition limit non-compliant with the budget? And it is, and that is not uncommon for us. Services and programs evolve and change over the years, and the intent would be then to amend the bylaw in order to bring it into compliance with the requisition limit. And we do that through the budgeting process. So for the Cleveland Parks and Recreation Service, we go out to the commission each year and we talk about what the program will be for the next year. And we talk about the budget that's going to be required to support that program. They make some recommendations to the board. It comes into the board in the budget process. We consult on the budget throughout each of the electoral areas and in our member municipalities. And then the board votes on the budget. And if that budget amount is approved, we submit that with our requisition to the province for collection. In this case, what we'll do, because there's such a significant issue up for debate at this point, so with the borrowing bylaw for Sickle Point, that would certainly have an impact on the taxes required. So when we talk to the province about moving the borrowing bylaw forward, they put a couple of conditions on that. They're certainly aware of the requisition limit and the need to amend the requisition limit in the bylaw, and that can be done by director assent. What they've said is that we have to do additional consultation in the borrowing bylaw process, which is what Mr. Thompson advised everybody of at the start of the session. So they're aware of it, we're aware of it. We're going to find out what the electors in that area want to do. And if the bylaw is successful, we'll make the amendment to the establishment bylaw to correct the requisition limit. And if it is unsuccessful, then we'll make the amendments to the service establishment bylaw to bring it into accord with what we need to run the 2021 process or budget for that service. So lots of moving parts in this, and there's some variables that we have yet to find out about, but in the end, that requisition limit will be amended to bring it up to the amount of money that we need to run that program. And that is a typical process for us. We have many other services that are evolving as well, some requisitions out of compliance that will also be corrected. So I will then turn that back to you, Mr. Moderator, and go on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newell. In just a moment, we'll have our question and answer session. We'll also hear from the Manager of Finance, but to give us a quick update on how this alternative approval process works, the Manager of Legislative Services joins us, Christy Malden.
Thanks very much, Eric. So I think the CAO walked fairly clearly through the initial aspect of an alternative approval process and why a local government would use it. I've had a couple questions, actually more than a few, of people inquiring about the elector response form, which is the form that one would use if they wanted to register opposition to it. So if an elector is in favor, they simply do nothing. They aren't required to return that form. That's only if you are opposed to that. So important to note there. Monday, February 8th at 4:30 is the deadline for eligible electors to register their opposition using that elector response form. So right up until 4:30, we can receive those responses at the counter or dropped in the mail slot at the front, or they may come in the Canada Post mail that day. So because this is a matter of interest to many, and it's a big topic out in the Colleen and Twin Lakes area, we will advise our board of directors of the results via email on February 9th. So that's Tuesday, February 9th. That's the day after the AAP closes. And then shortly thereafter, the results will be posted on the RDOS website and on our social media outlets, so that people who are waiting can know what the outcome of this alternative approval process was. After that, a report will go to the board on the meeting of February 18th, and the board will decide from there, as the CAO outlined, how to proceed from there. I think that's pretty much all I have about the AAP process.
Great, thank you very much. And now we'll go to Jim Zaffino. Mr. Zaffino is Manager of Finance with the Regional District.
Thank you, Eric. So if Sickle Point's going to be purchased, as stated earlier, we will have to borrow some funds. Local governments are restricted in borrowing funds. We could only borrow from the Municipal Finance Authority. That's a requirement from the province. Although they have a very competitive rate, it's very hard to beat. So what will happen is, if this does go through, they'll have to have provincial approval even after there's electoral assent for the bylaw. The debt servicing is based on the rate that we will have at the point we actually purchase the property. That rate is fixed for 10 years. After 10 years, we have to relook at the rate and actually accept what MFA states. The total debt servicing that we're looking at is over 25 years. The debt servicing is taken back from from assessment of your properties. So most municipalities and regional districts recoup tax requisitions based on the tax of your property, and that's what we've done here also. So that's essentially all I really have to say about the borrowing.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. And now we'll get to our question and answers. And I just want to remind everyone watching that you can get more information at www.rdosregionalconnections.ca. You can check the Q&A section under referendum and alternative approval process on that page for any additional information from this electronic town hall. Now, again, if you're participating by computer using WebEx, please click the raise hand button that can be found in the participants panel. It's on the right side of your computer screen. That will indicate that you'd like to speak, and you can also ask questions via WebEx Messenger. If you're participating via phone, please press *3 on your phone's keypad. That will indicate that you'd like to speak as well. And again, if you have raised your hand using WebEx, please remember to lower it, also using *3. We'll get to some questions first of all, and I'm going to start with questions that have been in our WebEx Messenger here now for a moment or two. Excuse me, from Mr. Brennan Phillips. I believe he's with the Penticton Western. And I'm going to direct the first one there to our CAO, Mr. Newell. And that question is, would there be considerations if the alternative approval did not pass for the RDOS to consider redrawing the area of the Colleen Parks and Rec area? Mr. Newell?
Be up to the electors in the area. You have to, you can change service area, but you would have to do it in the same manner that you had passed the establishment bylaw initially. So that would be a referendum.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to a call now. I see we have here Dallas. And I'll ask our Information Services Manager, Danny, to confirm that we have that person. Dallas, go ahead, please. Hi there, did you have a question you wanted to ask? I believe the name is Dallas Buckingham. All right, we'll come back to that. Let's go now back to our WebEx Messenger. And Mr. Phillips again was asking a follow-up. To be clear, is amending the requisition limit contingent on the approval or the disapproval of the borrowing bylaw? I'll ask CAO Newell to address that one if you can, please.
Either way, certainly if the borrowing bylaw is successful, we're going to have to amend the requisition limit to accommodate the principal and interest that we'll have to pay on the loan, and that will go into the Fleet and Parks and Recreation Service budget. If it fails, then we still have to bring our requisition limit into compliance with the 2021 budget. So as soon as the board sets the budget, we would bring that bylaw forward for amendment to raise the limit to meet that budget.
Question now from Doreen Olson. Doreen is joining us through WebEx. Doreen, go ahead, please, if you have a question.
Thank you. I have two small questions, or maybe not. There is a group who are fundraising to purchase Sickle Point for the community. What happens if they are successful and raise all of the money or part of the money? That's my first question. And my second question is, should Sickle Point be secured? Could the zoning be conservation instead of parkland? Thank you.
CAO Newell.
We go through the borrowing bylaw process and we acquire Sickle Point as a park, which is what the borrowing bylaw is for, then we would administratively bring that zoning amendment to the board for discussion, and it would be up to the board to determine whether to rezone a park. But I would think that is almost a regulatory requirement once the borrowing bylaw has been approved. On the second part, it's really all about timing. So the borrowing bylaw says that we can borrow up to 3.5 million. Our offer is in at 2.5. We would certainly not borrow any more money than we needed. And if there was fundraising to offset the amount that's required to borrow, we would be able to reduce that amount. And that could extend out some time, and maybe Mr. Sfino can provide more on this, but we would only do short-term borrowing initially, and we wouldn't have to lock that in with the Municipal Finance Authority until we wanted to, really. So fundraising could still go on, and then we could reduce the debt, and that would then reduce the budget.
Mr. Zaffino, did you want to add anything to that?
The CAO said it all. That's correct.
Okay. And there was a follow-up question here, or a question related to that, Mr. Newell, that I'll ask you to add something to, if you have anything to add to it. Has there been any exploration for other private or public organizations to help purchase Sickle Point?
You know, we've got a very active group out in Colleen that is pursuing every opportunity they have for a fundraising point of view. They're talking to foundations and other organizations that may be willing to chip in. And I'm sure they're going to be successful. It's just going to take a little bit of time in order for them to secure those types of donations. So we're very optimistic that a lot of this will be able to be covered by fundraising.
All right, and Doreen Olson, I hope we answered your questions for you. I see you have your hand up. If you're done asking questions, if you could hit *3, please, and that will lower your hand. You're certainly welcome to come back and ask more questions if you have some. I want to get back to our WebEx Messenger now, and a note here from Penny Hirsch, who is responsible for media liaison. The reason is, how come Penticton Western dated January 13th stated that opposing electors can submit a response form available from the RDOS website via mail, fax, or email before February 8th. That information was not correct, and it is my job as a communications coordinator to correct it. So I certainly did contact the Penticton Western, who were very gracious in offering to make the adjustment. Not sure where that original information came from. Certainly didn't come from the RDOS. But again, we do appreciate the quick response from the Penticton Western in clarifying that information. And at that point, I think I'll ask our Manager of Legislative Services if there's anything she wanted to add on that note. If not, we'll move on to WebEx Messenger.
Thank you. No, I'm fine.
Okay. We seem to have some background noise. That may be from our other microphones that are on, but we have quite a few more questions here coming in. So I will go back to WebEx Messenger. And let's go to a question here. Why is a small community expected to purchase a property that will be public use? Why not the province? Mr. Newell.
So the Local Government Act requires a borrowing bylaw to be attached to a service. In this case, the most apparent service for that to be attached to would be the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service. So that's why it was attached to that. And as soon as we do attach it to a service, and that geographic area comes into play, and only those electors within that geographic area can vote, because they are the ones that would be charged with paying.
Thank you. Penny Hirsch asked a question here, a follow-up, wondering how many of the folks on this panel are residents of Colleen. Not sure where that fits into things, but I don't believe, from my knowledge of this panel, anyone lives in Colleen. No. So none of the presenters, but thank you for asking. Let's see, there is another question. I'm going to go back to Mr. Phillips from the Penticton Western. He said services can run over the requisition limit for whatever reason. CAO Newell mentioned that other services do this. How much do those other overruns tend to be, and how often are these requisition limits changed? Mr. Newell?
They can vary as to how much they're over. I know that our Manager of Legislative Services has a bylaw hospital. We have quite a list in there, and our intent is then to bring those forward as expediently as possible as time allows.
And Mr. Phillips had a follow-up to that. He was wondering why the Colleen Park and Rec Service was not amended in a previous year's budget.
Yeah, services tend to creep. So each year there will be some sort of an incremental increase, either through just inflation or new programs that we identify that we want to undertake. So at the appropriate time, we'll bring those bylaws forward and do an amendment. We did bring the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service Establishment Bylaw forward to include parks within the purpose statement of the bylaw. And that was a requirement of the Inspector of Municipalities for us to proceed with the borrowing bylaw. So this is an old service, and the establishment bylaw is over 30 years old, and sometimes they just need amendment.
And a follow-up from a question that was posed earlier, just to clarify, Paul says that the question is, why are we, I'm assuming a Colleen residents or residents in that recreation service, responsible for paying for something that is public? Is there anything you can add to that, Mr. Newell?
Well, all of the assets of the regional district are public. So can I just go back, the participant that asked about where we live. So I live in Okanagan Falls, and I know that we had a similar situation where the Okanagan Falls Recreation Service includes Heritage Hills and Skaha Estates. And at one point, residents in those areas were concerned about whether they were getting value for money. But, you know, they jumped up and they represented on the commission, and they worked hard to do their own fundraising. We just commissioned a wonderful park out in Heritage Hills. And we're working with Skaha Estates to develop, in their case, what ends up being road ends that we can use for public purposes. So it's all about really what the community wants to give back to their recreation service. And that then is the alternative to wondering how you get out, to wondering how you get value from it. And there's the alternative that citizens might want to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Newell. Question now from John, who has his hand up raised. So we'll see if we can bring John into the conversation. John, go ahead, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, my question is, I saw a couple of areas, one on Facebook and one in the Herald, and I'm really surprised nobody brought this up in your opening statements. But they're talking about the amount of taxes that you're allowed to take every year, and that you've exceeded that amount in the last numerous years. I'm wondering if you can, if you guys know anything about this, or if you can clarify it, because it's pretty important.
Yeah, I'll go to our CAO, Mr. Newell, on that one. That was addressed earlier on. And Mr. Newell, did you want to add anything on that?
I got sort of a cut in and out sort of thing. Is that the one about the requisition limit?
Yeah.
Nope,
Yeah.
It has to do with you're allowed to take certain amount of percentage of taxes every year for different areas. And both on, I think it was on the Penticton Herald, where it says you've exceeded that amount in the last few years. And I don't know, do you guys not know anything about this?
Yeah, so in the Local Government Act, sir, it's called the Requisition Limit. It's a requirement to put in a service establishment bylaw. And the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service has that requisition limit in it. And it can either be a finite amount or it can be attached to the assessment roll. And it would float up with the increase in assessment from year to year. So with the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service, that requisition limit has been exceeded. And what I explained earlier was that we go through an extensive process with the Commission to identify a program for the service. We go through a budgeting process, which is widely communicated and consulted on, and then the Board of Directors approves the budget. And then eventually, over time, we'll go ahead and bring the establishment bylaw forward for amendment to make sure that the requisition limit reflects the budget. In this case, because of the significant impact on the budget for borrowing that amount of money to purchase Sickle Point, when we talked to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs about the borrowing bylaw and made them aware of the lack of compliance, they said, well, because it's so significant, we'll put a couple of extra conditions on the borrowing bylaw. So you got to consult extra, and you need to make sure that the community is aware of the impact of that. And then when we determine whether we're going to borrow the money or not, then we would bring the establishment bylaw forward to bring it into compliance.
Does that answer your question, John?
No, it's not. We're not talking the same thing here. This has nothing to do with Sickle Point. This has to do with an amount of taxes you're allowed to take. I believe it was for the Parks and Recreation. The percentage that you're allowed to take every year. Someone is saying that you've exceeded that amount in the past years. It has nothing to do with Sickle Point. It has to do with it's taking more taxes than you were allowed to take every year for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or something. Do you not know what I'm talking about? It was in the paper, the Penticton Herald.
Yeah, and like I explained earlier, we have a number of bylaws in that situation. This is an old service. The program has evolved over the years, and sometimes they do go out of compliance. We have a number of bylaws in our bylaw hospital, and we're going to eventually bring them forward to the board. They'll make the amendments to the requisition limits to bring them into compliance, and they can do that by director consent.
All right, we'll leave it there, and I want to ask Christy Malden, the Manager of Legislative Services, if you could just jump in for a moment, if you don't mind. When we hear the term bylaw hospital, some people might not know what that means. Would you be able to explain that?
Sure. That's an internal terminology that we use here for any bylaw that requires attention in some form. So whether it's exceeded its requisition limit or whether the scope needs to be evaluated, anytime a bylaw needs attention in some form, we isolate it and we bring it into a designated area. And our goal is to tackle that and make those amendments as soon as we possibly can with the resources that we have. So, some of them are quicker than others, but our goal is to get those done as soon as possible and get them up to the board.
Thank you, Ms. Malden. Back to WebEx Messenger. A question here from Evelyn. If the AAP fails, meaning there are more than 182 responses, can the bylaw be amended and reduced to the amount that is actually needed? $2.5 million minus the $285,000 that has been raised. Mr. Newell, did you want to tackle that, or how about Mr. Zaffino?
Well, I think we'll turn it over to Ms. Malden as far as I believe that the bylaw if it fails, it has to be rescinded and we come forward with a new one, but under the referendum process. But that would be a board decision once we know the results of the alternative approval process. I don't think we would amend it.
So I can clarify that a little if you'd like. We wouldn't amend it. That's absolutely correct. Because it's had third reading already, and because a process is underway at that established limit, the bylaw would have to be taken back and brought forward in a different form. However, if it's headed to referendum at 3.5 million, that's a different story. So if the limit is to be adjusted or the scope, then yes, it would have to go back.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Phillips has a few more questions here. This one is, for residents in the service area in Twin Lakes or St. Andrews, there have been concerns expressed that they are not necessarily seeing benefit from the service they are paying into. What can we say to those residents? Mr. Newell?
Yeah, so they should get represented on the commission and get involved in the planning of the recreation program and the budget. That would be the best way.
Okay. And a follow-up from Mr. Phillips. What does the service provide for those communities, and what ways are there for residents to seek that they have their voices heard and more services to the area, which is basically what you just mentioned, Mr. Newell?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and we did have someone send us a link to the article for the Penticton Herald. I haven't had a chance to read that article. I should say. And certainly I'm sure we'll hear more from our media outlets on questions around this issue and others. And we certainly always try to provide as much information as possible. And thank you for saying that link to us. And also one other question here, I seem to have lost it. Oh, the property has been, this is from Penny Hirsch. She says the property has been a hornet in Colleen and area's bonnet for years. Back in July 2014, there was a move for a land exchange that seemed to die as of today. Is there any option for this to be considered? A land exchange, Mr. Newell?
Boy, I'm not a party to those discussions. I know that it is privately held, and if the owner had determined some other mechanism to exchange land for that, I'm not aware of it. The only the other part of this is the KVR runs directly adjacent to Sickle Point, and that had been privately held and privately sold a number of years ago, and maybe that is somehow crossing into this story. But I'm not aware of Sickle Point going through that process.
All right. I'll just remind those of you watching, if you're participating by computer using WebEx, if you click raise hand, which can be found in the participants panel on the right side of your screen, that will indicate that you would like to speak. And you can also ask questions via WebEx Messenger. If you're participating by phone, press *3 on your phone's keypad, and that will indicate that you would like to speak. And having indicated that you would like to speak, you'd be placed in the queue. And I don't see that we have anybody right now who is waiting to speak. Oh, we do have one. Looks like Doreen Olson is back with the questions. So let's go to, oh, no, sorry, we have Cindy. Is that right? Yeah, Cindy.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
I'd like to know where in the budget is the allocated amount to actually take care of this land should RDOS acquire it? And especially the fact that if we're going to use it as a conservation property, I've heard that then we would consult biologists and all kinds of professionals as to exactly how we would preserve it. And I'd like to know just where that money is coming from.
Okay, thank you, Cindy.
But if the regional district was to purchase it, I think the operating arrangements have yet to be discussed. And exactly what the program will be for that property, we're not sure. We certainly would consult with other interested parties that could help us with it, but we don't have a program for it right now.
Does that answer your question?
Well, no, because then, so we don't actually have a budget as to what we're going to do with it after. We don't have plans, so we are going to, can you tell me, will there be more money spent after the fact that we are not aware of?
So there would be no program on the property in 2021 unless it was done through fundraising. And then that will be established for the 2022 budget for operations.
And exactly where would that money come from?
Depending on what the program is, they may just keep it in its current state. So we don't know what the program would be or what the cost would be. But if there is a cost in the future, it would come out of the Parks and Recreation Service.
So there is a possibility of it costing even more than the purchase price, which has not actually been accounted for in any budget at this point.
That would be true.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. We'll go back to Doreen Olson. She has another question for us. Doreen, go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering about, you mentioned the KVR trail, and it's my understanding that access to this property at Sickle Point, should it be sold to a developer in the next step, is via the KVR trail. So would that mean that vehicles can go back and forth on that property that are required to service the house or whatever kind of dwelling is there? So essentially it becomes a motorized trail to the gate of where Sickle Point is on the KVR.
Mr. Newell?
Thanks. Yes, the current owner has a legal easement registered along the KVR trail that he worked out with the province. And that basically serves as the driveway to Sickle Point.
So then who would maintain that portion of that access?
Well, just like any property owner, you maintain your own driveway.
So he would, in the winter, probably plow it or whatever? And
Yeah. We don't do a lot of maintenance on the trails in the winter, so I would probably be left to the property owner.
Okay, so,
Right.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. It looks like we have a call on coming in. It says call in user 4. Is that somebody we can bring in right now? Hello, can you hear us now?
Hello.
Hello there.
Yes, hi. You mentioned earlier about an article in the Western News giving the wrong instructions to submit your forms to the RDOS, and it was corrected apparently. And so what happens to those forms that were submitted prior to that incorrectly?
Thank you for your question. I'll bring in our Manager of Legislative Services, but what I can tell you is that anybody, well, actually, I'll let Ms. Malden explain that if you don't mind.
Not at all. Thanks very much. So that misprint or that misinformation occurred fairly early in the process. If we would have received any that in a form that wasn't acceptable to us, we would have contacted the individual and had them resubmit with the required method. So again, we haven't seen any forms come in based on that misinformation that was provided. But had we done that, we would have immediately contacted the individual.
Could I ask a second question?
Sure, go ahead, please.
So once all the ballot or all the forms are in, what process takes place to ensure, I guess, transparency in the counting of these forms?
Ms. Malden?
Thank you. So we take each form individually and we check to see whether the name on the form is actually a homeowner. We also separate forms which may be duplicates or forms which come from outside of British Columbia. And basically the board receives a report of those forms which were eligible, those forms which came from outside British Columbia, and those forms which were duplicates. So they have an idea as to how many actual forms were received by the regional district. So it's not a lengthy process, and we anticipate, again, that we'll have that information out the next day, February 9th.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for your call. Question here on WebEx Messenger from Neil Moretti, who says, has the RDOS considered selling Colleen property or assets to raise funds to purchase Sickle Point? Mr. Newell, has that been discussed at all that you know of?
There's been no discussion on that, but really it's very difficult to get rid of parkland. We have purchased a lot of it through our parkland dedication, and you can really only use that property for parkland. Other properties, we don't own a lot of other properties in Colleen, so that wouldn't be a case there.
Okay, and a couple of other questions here. One is asking about why Twin Lakes is included in the purchase of Sickle Point. Would you like to try and explain that one again? I think we've kind of touched on it already, that it's part of the recreation service, but Mr. Newell, is that something you can add anything to?
Yeah, so back in 1988, when the service was contemplated, the regional district would have gone out and defined a geographic area, and only those electors within that geographic area would have voted if they wanted to create that service. And it was successful at the time. So that geographic area is entrenched in the service establishment bylaw. And that's why only those people are participating in this process.
Thank you, Mr. Newell, and I'll remind our callers, if you can hit *3 if you've already asked your question, just to lower your hand. We see 2 hands are still up there. And we'll go back to WebEx Messenger. And Jennifer Strong's asking if we could please answer the earlier question regarding why a small community is tasked with paying for this rather than the province. I'm going to have to ask you if you can weigh in on that, Mr. Newell, but it doesn't seem like the province would necessarily pay for it in this particular case. Is there anything you can add to that?
We haven't seen any evidence that the province is willing to step up and either provide a grant or purchase the property themselves. So then that's why we're out now testing to see if the electors in the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service want to buy it. And if not, then it would remain in private hands.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, one more question from Mr. Phillips. Another clarification for residents, the overrun in taxes, he calls it, it was to pay for costs for service. It was not raised for reserves or anything like that. Mr. Newell?
So really the administration of the service is done through the budgeting process. And each year the Parks and Recreation Commission and the Board of Directors goes through the program for the next year, and they then set a requisition limit which we turn into the province, and they collect the taxes on it. The requisition limit in the service establishment bylaw, we will bring that into compliance in the next year, but it's really the budget that sets taxes.
All right, and Ms. Malden, a comment for you here from Dan. He says that you had said that the RDOS would be checking the forms to see if the person submitting the form was a homeowner, and Dan doesn't believe that that is a requirement. Can you please comment on that?
So that has been our process, is to just check the form. to sort of certify it that indeed the individual is the homeowner. Obviously, there are going to be renters as well, registering forms. I should mention the form that is provided is pretty explicit in its requirements, and each person who signs this form is taking a declaration, much like they do when they register for a ballot at election time. So we believe that each individual, is taking this seriously, this declaration seriously. So, when we have a renter, and we certainly can't verify everybody's address for sure, by signing that declaration, they're committing to declaring accurate information as to whether they're an eligible elector or not.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Malden. I see we still have 2 hands up. I believe those are previous questions. So I'll just check with Danny, our Information Services Manager. Those folks aren't waiting to re-ask a question, are they?
As far as I can tell, it's still from previous.
Yeah, that was from previously. And then we don't have any other WebEx questions, so I'll just reiterate a couple of things, and then if we have no further questions, we will likely wrap up. We are just about out of time anyway. But a reminder that you can find out all the information you require for this at www.rdosregionalconnections.ca. Just going to check in with Danny again.
One new hand raised.
We do have a hand? Okay. Yeah, so if you visit that website, it's the dedicated public engagement website for the RDOS. You can find the information you require for both the AAP for Sickle Point and for the other ongoing, the other AAP that's underway right now, which is for Naramata. And we will go to another question, and we're coming back to, it looks like we have call-in user number 5 is all the information I have right now. So if you can hear me, go ahead with your question, please. Hello, can you hear us? Looks like it's a 778 number, and they've unmuted themselves, so go ahead, please.
Hello?
Hi there, you're on. Go ahead, please. Do you have a question about the alternative approval process for Sickle Point?
Yeah, I do actually. And I'm wondering, when we drop off our objections to the RDOS, how do we know that you're actually going to be counted and that some of them don't end up being misplaced, shredded, and so forth? How do we know there's actual integrity in this matter?
Well, I will ask our Manager of Legislative Services to answer that question. Ms. Malden?
Thanks. Thank you. So much like any other process, elections or assent voting, that sort of thing, we have a process in place with these forms. They're received, they're put in the same folder, and they're brought back to me in the very same way, each one of them. So, the process is in place there. Other than that, I can't respond to, questioning as to the integrity. Certainly, that's what we're hired for. That's what we do when we conduct a process.
Well, I get it. That's the claim, but there seems to be a lot of drive by RDOS on behalf of this special interest group. I guess another question that comes to mind here is, what if a special interest group in Colleen and another one in St. Andrews decides that they also want to borrow $3.5 million or up to $3.5 million? And then, of course, since we are asking them to subsidize this event or this thing here, Sickle Point, why shouldn't they be allowed to borrow the same amount of money for their own purposes in those other 2 communities?
Maybe Mr. Newell, would you like to provide some insight into that question?
Yeah, so I think I got that. The borrowing bylaw process is attached to a service, and all of those communities, I believe, that you mentioned, so St. Andrews and Twin Lakes, are part of the Colleen Parks and Recreation Service. It would have to go through the same process. It would have to, if there was a park in St. Andrews that the community wanted to build, or if it was in Twin Lakes, they would come through the Recreation Commission, make a recommendation to the Board of Directors. The Board of Directors would determine whether they wanted to test whether the community wanted to purchase that or not. So as I mentioned before, the regional district is the regulator. It's up to the community to vote one way or the other, whether they want that asset to be borrowed for or not.
So essentially what could happen, if this were to happen, then our taxes could go up triple of what has been said just for Sickle Point, correct?
You have to vote on it, sir. That's the tax.
I get that, but if we follow through the same process that this is going through, then it is conceivable that we could end up with triple the taxes, correct?
If the community votes, if the electors in the service area vote to purchase that property, then yes, we would borrow the money and your taxes would go up.
Yeah. So, need I say more? No, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's the point where you really have to decide what process you want. So in this case, there are those people for purchasing the property, there are those against. You have the opportunity during the alternative assent process to put your point of view forward. And in the end, those eligible electors will vote and they will determine whether they want to borrow the money or not. And we'll go with the majority.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Cindy. She asked a question earlier, but I just wanted to clarify and ask Ms. Malden if you could, please. Dan, who was asking earlier, he just wanted clarification on whether where the homeowner versus a renter fits in on filling out the elector form.
So if a renter or a homeowner live within that area and they meet the requirements as an eligible elector, both forms are treated exactly the same.
Okay. And let's go to Cindy. Cindy has one more follow-up question. Cindy, go ahead, please.
Thank you. There was a little brief discussion earlier on the KVR trail access to Sickle Point, and that if a private homeowner was to buy Sickle Point, they do have that access, but it was said that the RDOS does not maintain that trail. So if the RDOS was to purchase Sickle Point, would they not be needing to A, maintain the trail, and B, use vehicles to access Sickle Point so that they could do whatever might be required depending on the development that the RDOS deemed permissible, whether it be a nature park, a conservation area, a beach? There's going to be maintenance. So would the RDOS not need to then A, maintain the trail, and B, use the KVR to get there?
Mr. Newell, can you add anything to that?
So the regional district does maintain the KVR trail. You may have misunderstood. My intention was to say that we don't maintain private driveways, and the current owner of Sickle Point has a legal easement attached to the title of Sickle Point, and it would be up to him to clear his own driveway. We don't do a lot of trail maintenance in the winter.
But if the RDOS was to buy Sickle Point, would we not also need RDOS vehicles going back and forth on the KVR in order to maintain Sickle Point itself?
We do have vehicles on the trail for maintenance now, ma'am, all the way up and down the KVR.
Okay, thank you.
There we go. I think I was muted. Sorry about that. Talking to myself there for a moment. I was having a good chat. What I was trying to say was that any information that comes in late, we will certainly make sure that information is posted on rdusregionalconnections.ca. Any new information as well will be posted there. We do really appreciate everyone who took part. We'd like to thank our panelists as well and recognize our board members who are watching and listening as well, and no doubt taking notes. It's all part of the process for us to ask these questions, answer as much as we can with the information that's available, and that's the job here of the RDOS. So that's why we created rdusregionalconnections.ca to connect you with as much information as possible. And we do thank you very much for taking time to be part of this tonight. Thank you.